Jake Bamford. I've been in the bus industry since 1997 and I've owned a preserved bus since 2001.
And this is one of my vehicles, a 1980 Leyland Leopard coach with dual dominant bodywork, new to Maidstone and District and later with Hastings and District. She sounds lovely.
So this is going to be a series of YouTube videos about the logistics and legalities and the fun of owning buses. But now, whether you want to use a bus for preservation, whether you want to use a bus as a mobile home, a shop, or any other business opportunity, even if you want to run a bus as a wedding bus or anything like that, stay tuned. I hopefully will have all the answers and what's involved and try and cover as much as I can over the next few videos.
Hello and welcome. When it comes to bus preservation, one of the toughest questions that I think you can be asked is why preserve an old bus? There's many different reasons. Mostly they are to do with the sights, the sounds and the smells of a particular vehicle, but it does have a very large slice of nostalgia. People associate travelling on a certain kind of bus, going to school, going to stay with a relative, going on holiday. Various different memories tend to come flooding back when they see, hear and smell a particular type of bus. And as a result of this, bus preservation is a very, very personal thing. It's a very personal choice what particular vehicle you want to go for. But it's one thing to dream a dream of owning a bus and a completely different thing to actually owning one. In this video we will look at the types of bus rather than the makes of bus and what might be the best type of bus for you. We'll start with minibuses and work our way up to double-deckers. If you're lucky enough to have a large driveway which is safely next to your house, you could look at having something small like this Lex London Transport GS. But in my opinion, a vehicle of this vintage will always need undercover accommodation. If you don't have this undercover accommodation, that could still leave you with the option of something a little bit more modern like this Iveco minibus or an old Ford Transit minibus. Now, before you lynch me for suggesting that you preserve a minibus, these little things fought on the front line during deregulation. With these, bus companies could increase frequency in bus routes and serve areas that big buses just couldn't get into. The humble minibus has played a huge part in the more modern bus industry. Now, these little gems can be very easy and cheaper to maintain than their big bus companions, and therefore would make a great entry level into bus preservation. Parts tend to be quite easy to get for these depending on what make and model you go for. These parts are shared with the common van version, which means it's not been unknown for minibuses to be stolen for spare parts. This obviously doesn't help with the size of them, so you will need some form of anti-theft device. If you do take the plunge with something like this, especially this old Transit for example, you will need to be on very good terms with a welder because they do suffer from rot. Minibuses have really good fuel economy, but the downside is that at the moment most of them are too modern to be considered an historic vehicle, so you'll be paying road tax and for MOTs. Earlier on I mentioned being good friends with a welder. Now this leads us very nicely into owning a Dennis Dart or a midibus. Now you're lucky you might be able to get one of these on your driveway, but to be fair you're getting to the size vehicle where you will probably need to put them into some form of secure storage. It's worth remembering that when you do go for bus ownership, the majority of your money will be spent on storage. This can be anywhere from £80 to £150 a month to park your bus. Of course, this depends on which part of the country you live in, as well as whether you go for outdoor or indoor accommodation. Like their smaller minibus counterparts, these buses do tend to have quite good fuel consumption. But again, they tend to be of a more modern type, which means you will be paying for MOTs and road tax. It's also worth remembering if you pay road tax, you will more than likely have to pay some form of LEZ or clean air tax if there is one in your area. Also, a lot of modern vehicles do have AdBlue systems as well, and this is going to be an extra cost to factor into running your vehicle, buying the AdBlue and filling up the AdBlue tank. Also, anything from the 1990s onwards tends to have some kind of diagnostic system on there, so you might need somebody with a laptop at some point to come and talk to your bus to find out why it's decided to throw a bit of a hissy fit and not start. MIDI buses tend to be a little bit more complicated mechanically and electronically, and the parts aren't quite so readily available. Moving on to full-size single-deckers. Older single-decker buses tend to have the same fuel consumption as their double-decker counterparts. This is because most of the time they tend to use very similar or the same engines, and they've just been converted to go horizontally underneath the bus, in the middle or at the rear. Because of this, when it comes to maintenance, you'll find yourself either laying on your back looking up at your engine, or laying inside the vehicle on your stomach with your head and shoulders in a hole in the floor looking down at your engine. It's a bit like keyhole surgery for buses. Your average single decker tends to be over the 10-metre mark. They normally between 10 and 12 metres long. This extra length, in my experience, may make it harder to find some accommodation for your vehicle. It does tend to be a little bit easier to find accommodation for a 9-metre long Bristol VR than it does for a 12-metre long Leyland Leopard. This really is one of those occasions where size does matter. Single-decker buses tend to come in many shapes and sizes, and there's lots of variety, so there is really something that appeals to everybody with these. As with all vehicles, the newer ones will need to be MOT'd and taxed. Once they pass the 40-year-old exemption though, they can become a historic vehicle. Please see the other video in this series for vehicle taxation. So while we're talking about single deckers, what about coaches then? They tend to have a much harder life than your average service bus. They tend to have much greater mileage, and this mileage is normally run at full speed or much higher speeds. This means that mechanically they can be a little bit more worn out, and the bodywork with all the spray and the water hitting them at 60 miles an hour does tend to rot and deteriorate a lot more. Without stating the obvious, more modern vehicles will be more complicated. You will be faced with entertainment systems, toilets, serveries, air conditioning, and of course our much loved AdBlue system, to name a few. So what about double deckers then? As a rule of thumb, any front-engined, rear-loading traditional double-decker bus is going to be much more expensive to buy than a more modern rear-engine bus, especially if it's a Routemaster, where the prices concerned are ridiculously high. Don't get me wrong, I like Routemasters, but just not enough to spend £50,000 or £60,000 on. Other makes and models of traditional style front engine buses won't be as expensive as this, unless of course it's a Bristol low decker and you're looking at buying it from abroad, and then their prices can be equal to a Routemaster. First generation rear engine buses also seem to hold their price when they're fully restored, and this is the key thing. It depends on what sort of condition the bus is in that you are looking at purchasing. If it's fully restored and roadworthy, then you must expect to pay a very good price for it. If it's not restored and unroadworthy and in bits, then you can negotiate with the price. As with their single deck counterparts, newer makes and models tend to have more complicated systems to look after, things like electronic fuel pumps, AdBlue systems, and slightly more complicated electrics. I will be doing a future video on the pitfalls of owning particular types of buses at a later date. But all I will say now, if you're intending on preserving an MCW Metro bus, a Leyland Olympian, a Volvo Olympian or one of these Scania Metropolitans, you will need to practice on your welding skills. So to round up then, it's always best to have a look at what's available out there. Remember, most of your money will go on storage costs. If you can't do any work on the bus yourself, you will need to get a commercial mechanic in to do it for you, and these aren't cheap. The fuel economy on full-size single-deckers and double-deckers equates to every 2 miles you'll be putting a litre of fuel in. So that's another thing to consider, as well as newer vehicles and the gobbling up AdBlue. A good way of keeping costs down is through joint ownership, but you need to make sure that your fellow co-owners are the right people to go into a partnership with. Many preserved buses have found themselves in a bit of a sticky situation due to such partnerships failing and breaking down. Bus preservation certainly isn't a cheap hobby, but it's one that is very rewarding. If you have your eyes set on a certain kind of vehicle, it's always best to speak to owners and see what they think. In the future, I will be releasing a video about the best buses out there for mobile home conversions, and I will be releasing another video about where you can actually buy buses from. Thank you for watching. If this video preserved your faith in owning a bus, please like, share and subscribe. This helps the channel grow and helps encourage me to do more videos.